towards a collision course with hyperinflation that would have been a full-blown crisis.
Brazil looks like a success story with its huge natural resources and growing cities. But what if I told you that behind this growth lies a huge economic crisis and millions of unseen homeless people? Record inflation, high interest rates, rising unemployment, and deepening inequality have become Brazil's constant problems. The minimum wage in Brazil is around $270, but in big cities like São Paulo, even average rents start at $350 to $400. For this, people have to work 2 jobs. The situation in the markets is not much different. When we look at market prices, they are pocket busting. People are struggling to afford even the most basic products. In 2024, we say that salaries have increased by 7 to 10%, but inflation has jumped to 5 to 6%, which means that the amount of money in the pocket has increased, but the value of money has not increased. That's why people are even trying to do their shopping in installments. As early as 2012, people in Brazil started to have an average of 2 credit cards. This is why the interest rate on credit cards in Brazil can be up to 300% per year. According to Brazil Defadden in 2023, 27.4% of the population, that's 59 million people, it work for an average daily wage just $6.85. According to the World Bank, Brazil's Gini coefficient is 0.518, which is very high by world standards and shows that Brazil is one of the most unequal countries in Latin America. In terms of income distribution, 10% of the population controls 43% of the country's income. The poorest 40% of the population has access to only 12% of the income. When we look at these ratios, it comes as no surprise that Brazil will be the 7th largest country in the world by the number of billionaires in 2024. When we look at the streets, we can see that a small part of the population lives in villas and luxury apartments, while a large part of the population lives in collapsed favelas, where there is not even clean water, crime and death rates are high. In short, this landscape creates 2 different worlds in one country. In this video, I will explain in detail why the Brazilian economy is rotten, its historical origins and reasons. Your help motivates me a lot while making these videos. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel before watching the video. To understand Brazil's economic system, we need to go back in time. Historical events and reforms are the cornerstones of how the economy got to where it is today. For this, we need to analyze history, item by item. It all started when Pedro Álvares Cabral, an explorer, traveled to India in 1500, without knowing what was about to happen. Seeing the fertile lands of Brazil, Portugal began to establish colonies here from 1530, because the newly discovered sugarcane was a great opportunity. Sugarcane was a luxury consumer product in Europe, and the profit margin was very high. However, the fact that the locals could not withstand European diseases and were against slavery led to the importation of slaves from Africa along with the plantation system. According to the data, between 1500 and 1800, around 4.9 million slaves were brought to Brazil, 40% of all slaves brought to the Americas. In the mid-1600s, Brazil alone accounted for 70% of the world's sugar exports. 90% of the country's economy came from sugar alone. This led to both undiversified growth of the economy and its dependence on foreign exchange. In the end, there was great inequality among the population, property owners became more powerful, and state authority weakened. But this first boom was not enough, and the same thing happened in the 1690s. The discovery of gold deposits in the Minas Gerais region of Brazil attracted the attention of Europe. Millions of slaves were treated inhumanely and forced to work in the mines to extract the gold. This time the wealth flowed into the pockets of small elite families. The gold that flowed to Portugal was spent on buying industrial products from England. In other words, every gold mine in Brazil directly affected the British economy. Between 1700 and 1800, Brazil provided 50% of the world's gold production. Along with gold, diamond deposits were also discovered at that time. This permanently caused major problems for the economy. For example, in the northeast of Brazil, sugar was produced. In the southeast, there were gold mines. As a result, the coastal regions of the country flourished, while the interior remained stagnant. The population was divided into 2, the landowners and the poor. Only 5% of the population owned more than 80% of the land, so the country was controlled by a few rich families. Brazil only sold goods abroad. This prevented industrialization, and the country's fate was determined by European consumption habits. A similar situation happened during the coffee empire. Again, a single product. Again, the same model, again, the same problems. The economy became too dependent on foreign markets. So when the demand for coffee in foreign markets decreased, the Brazilian economy collapsed. The domestic market was very weak. Most of the people were so poor that there was no domestic consumption. Everything was export-oriented. Inequality persisted during these years. The majority of incomes went into the pockets of small groups or to Europe, and there was normally no investment in industry. This system never really collapsed. It just changed shape. The Wall Street crash of 1929, for example, turned the world economy upside down. Coffee prices plummeted by 70%. Brazil's economic inequality today has its roots in this period. Industrialization was not very strong, which is why the economy is still dependent on natural resources: sugar, gold, then coffee. Brazil's economic history for the first 400 years was based on the same pattern: dependence on a single product, weak domestic market, extreme social inequality, high vulnerability to economic crises. Between 1968 and 1973, the Brazilian economy was growing at an average rate of 10% per year. Factories were being built, exports were increasing, and cities were modernizing. But with this growth came a rapid rise in foreign debt. It was a growth model in line with the demands of foreign investors in the global economy, but it carried with it many risks. The gap between rich and poor widened. While some cities developed rapidly, the countryside was almost forgotten. And then came the first big blow. The 1973 oil crisis forced Brazil to buy imported oil at much higher prices. Energy prices skyrocketed, and inflation began to climb rapidly. By 1980, the U.S. interest rate hikes had pushed developing countries like Brazil into a corner. They struggled to roll over their debts. And just 2 years later, Brazil could no longer pay its debts. The foreign debt had risen from about $10 billion in 1975 to $100 billion in 1983. To solve the crisis, austerity agreements were made with the IMF and the World Bank. The state froze wages and cut spending on health and education. But the result was much more severe for the population. In 1989, the inflation rate climbed to 1.972%. Between 1990 and 1993, the country was in the grip of hyperinflation. Inflation rose from 1.476% in 1990 to 2.477% by the end of 1993. When people shopped in the market, they witnessed prices changing instantaneously. One woman described it this way: "By the time I got to the checkout to buy cheese, the price had doubled." The state used shock therapy to counter this terrible situation, but without much success. In 1994, under the leadership of the new economy minister, a brand new currency, the Plano Real, was introduced. By that time, the currency had changed 6 times. With the new system, the exchange rate was fixed, the central bank became independent, and the reforms finally started to take effect. Over the years, inflation rates began to fall. However, this decline alone was not enough. In the 1980s, the central bank was constantly raising interest rates, while in the 1990s, even though inflation fell with the new currency, investors were still cautious. They demanded high interest rates, so much so that in 1995, interest rates were as high as 45%. Today, in 2025, interest rates are still hovering between 13.75% and 14.25%. Inflation and the high interest rates have put the Brazilian economy in a vicious circle. Because if there is fear of inflation, interest rates rise. When interest rates rise, consumption decreases. When consumption falls, growth slows down. When growth slows, government spending increases, which leads to new borrowing. The result? Interest rate pressure starts again. The main reason for this cycle is the negative perception and insecurity in the country. Economic actors refrain from investing unless they see stability in the future. This further increases uncertainty in the market. Looking at the April 2025 official data, the Brazilian economy is showing positive signals, but I don't know how much the deep structural problems increase the importance of these signals. The country's nominal GDP is around $2.13 trillion. The economy grew by 2.9% in 2023 and 3.4% in 2024, and is expected to grow by 2.3% in 2025. 2025, according to forecasts. Inflation, which has been a problem not only in Brazil, but also in many other countries in recent times, continues to burn. At the end of 2024, the annual inflation rate stood at 4.83%. Although this figure is well within the central bank's target band, it is putting serious pressure, especially on the poor. The average unemployment rate is 6.8%. Although progress has been made since the pandemic, the size of the economy means that millions of people are unemployed. In short, there is a long way to go. In a nutshell, all the reasons and historical events I have described have had a major impact on the Brazilian economy, which is built on a rotten system. But there may be a couple of underlying reasons that are overlooked. The first reason is that the economy has been in the hands of a few families for a long time, and these families still maintain a slavery mentality, which increases inequality. When we look at the data, we can see this clearly. Paper slavery seems to have ended, but its function continues in Brazil. The second reason is that perception is at the root of economic problems in general. There is a common problem in Latin American countries, the disease of money printing. Add to this high interest rates and an oppressive tax system, and we can see why inflation has persisted in these countries for years, even if it has been low in recent years. The third reason is the effect of women's fertility structure on the unemployment rate. Most of the population is very poor and tends to have children. Children often grow up without fathers, and mothers are forced to work. Add to this lack of education, low wages, and economic inefficiency, and unemployment increases. According to the data, women are more likely to work than men, meaning that men make up the majority of the unemployed. For too long, the Brazilian economy has been in the hands of the wrong people, who have their own interests in mind, not those of the people. These are my own interpretations based on the data. There is much to talk about, but time is short. So is the bad Brazilian economy affected by these last reasons? Meet me in the comments. Your help motivates me a lot while making these videos. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel before watching the video. See ya.